Joyeeta is Professor of Law and Policy in Water and Environmental Resources at the University of Amsterdam and at the ICRC Delft Institute for Water Education. And she's also the Faculty Professor on Sustainability, leads the program group on governance and inclusive development. She also used to be co-chair of the Earth Commission and is a member of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. In 2023, she's the winner of the Spinoza Prize, the highest prize in the Netherlands for academic work. So we are extremely honored and impatient, actually, to listen to Joyeeta. Welcome, Joyeeta.
Thank you. May I have my slides, please?
Sure.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be talking about a slightly larger story about Earth system boundaries as opposed to planetary boundaries. And my Earth system boundaries focuses on local to global boundaries. So it's not just at the global level. So that's one of the key differences. And the second difference is we focus on justice. This is also based on our outlook on Earth system justice. And then I'll talk a little bit about what minimum needs means for Earth system justice and how to move towards transformation. Next slide. So in our particular case, the Earth Commission decided to pick 5 because simply we didn't have the time. We looked at aerosols, climate, biosphere, water cycle, and nutrient cycles. Next slide. And we decided to look at safe boundaries. And a safe boundary is a boundary that maintains the resilience and stability of the Earth system. Next slide. What we then did was to identify 8 boundaries for the 5 domains that we have selected. So we basically had 2 boundaries for biosphere, 2 for water, and 2 for nutrients. Just to give you an example, we chose 1.5 degrees centigrade as the safe boundary for global warming because beyond 1.5, 4 tipping points can be triggered. In terms of biosphere, for intact nature, we say that the global system should protect 50 to 60% of nature in an intact manner. And in the areas that are actually managed ecosystems, so we're talking about cities and agricultural area, there 20 to 25% of every square kilometer should be devoted for nature. And then we have a number of different boundaries for other issues. For example, for groundwater, we say that you should not take out more water than you recharge. So these are our safe boundaries. Next slide. But the question is, are these safe boundaries just? Now, to identify what a boundary, when a boundary is just, we try to look at how to minimize exposure of humans to significant harm from Earth system change. Next slide. And therefore, we use basically an idea called Earth system justice. And Earth system justice builds on recognition justice or looking at the problem from the perspective of the weakest, and epistemic justice, so including other knowledge systems. It has 3 I's: interspecies and Earth system stability, intergenerational justice, and intragenerational justice. It has procedural and distributive or substantive justice. And then these elements are used to both create ends and means. So in terms of ends, we're looking at just no significant harm boundaries and just minimum access boundaries. And then we look at means to achieve these boundaries. And we have a number of ideas just addressing the drivers of ecological degradation and vulnerability. And how do we review existing allocation mechanisms? Next slide. So let's go to climate change. We discover that at 1.5 degrees centigrade already, there's significant harm to 200 to 500 million people. And therefore, we try to see at what level is the harm perhaps acceptable. We chose 1 degree centigrade because at 1 degree centigrade already, tens of millions of people are affected by the climate change problem. And therefore, we chose 1 degree centigrade as the just boundary. And because we take the most stringent of the safe and just boundaries, 1 degree centigrade is therefore the safe and just boundary for climate change. Next slide. So in using this approach, we tried to find out what would be the just boundaries for all the domains. And essentially, we concluded that there were 3 boundaries that would need to be changed: climate change, aerosol pollution, and nitrogen. Climate change, I've just explained. Nitrogen was because nitrogen pollution triggers eutrophication later than it triggers pollution to the water, such that it makes it more difficult to create drinking water. And therefore, we tightened the nitrogen budget. For aerosol pollution, we discovered that the aerosol pollution at the global level is not adequate to cover the aerosol pollution at the local level. And that led us to tighten the aerosol boundary. In this figure, what you see is the green area is the safe and just area within which humans should try to live. The red area is the safe boundary. The blue area is the just boundary. So this is roughly our proposal with respect to just boundaries. Next slide. Now I introduce the yellow balls. The yellow balls show where we are today in relation to these boundaries. And you will find that we have breached 7 out of the 8 globally defined boundaries. The only one that we have not yet breached at global level is aerosol pollution. However, aerosol pollution has been breached locally in many parts of the world. Next slide. And here you see that at least 2 boundaries have been breached in the areas that are between light yellow till dark red. And essentially, these boundaries have been breached for 52% of the land, as well as affects 86% of the world population. Next slide. So the question that comes up is, how can we live within the safe and just boundaries? And that basically means, next slide, how can we move into the green area? And in order to be able to move into the green area, the next question we want to discuss is, what does the Sustainable Development Goals imply in terms of these boundaries? So we took 4 goals in relation to access to food, water, energy, and infrastructure. And then we translated these goals into actual numbers per person. And then we multiplied it through a number of factors to identify what is the damage in terms of pressures per domain. Next slide. So here what you see is, in blue, we show the current pressure on the Earth system. As I mentioned earlier too, we have crossed all these boundaries. All the boundaries shown here have been crossed. Now, if in the year 2018-19, we were to meet the minimum needs of all people, and we have 2 levels, a dignified level beyond survival or escape from poverty. Dignified level is shown in yellow, escape from poverty in pink. Then you can see that we cross the boundaries even further. The message of this story is that if you want to meet minimum needs of all people worldwide, this is not possible without radical transformation of the current system in which we live. Next slide. And that basically means that if we are the yellow spot and the red line is the safe boundary, the blue, the just boundary, the question is there a corridor? Now, we have created a corridor by giving all humans on Earth, so everybody, including you and me, the minimum amounts of energy, water, food, and agriculture and infrastructure. And this basically means, in terms of energy, 3 bulbs and a refrigerator. And then we've identified what is the green space. Now, that space is quite limited. This work is currently in review, so I can't give you the numbers, but essentially we've identified the space that's available for all humans after you deduct a minimum amount for everybody. And the question is, how then do we allocate this green space to people? Now, in terms of transformation, to give a very brief account, we identified drivers such as accumulation, the need to continuously create wealth and accumulate that for some people, certain types of technology, consumerism, the development paradigm. In terms of trying to sort of solve the problem, we think it's very important to move forward on the issue of liability caused liability for harm that you cause to other people, to revisit allocation mechanisms today, which includes grandfathering, sovereignty, which determines who has access to what, markets, equity, etc. And the three major sectors that we think need focus on are energy, food, and resources. Next slide. So coming to my more or less last slide, for climate change, I think the key challenges are that in terms of countries, the rich countries are not yet prepared to give a clear signal to developing countries that they are willing to take legally binding reduction targets. In fact, anyway, developing countries have 70% of the remaining fossil fuels. And that's a big challenge because they feel that they should be able to use those fossil fuels. Moreover, developing countries have huge loans that they have to pay back. And they think that developing these fossil fuel resources will enable them to pay back those debts. If you look at companies, a very recent newspaper article talks about how ExxonMobil and Chevron are continuing to make today huge investments in new fossil fuel. And that's quite worrying. If you look at investors, investors continue to invest in fossil fuel. And what we find is that even though development banks, for example, are saying that they will not themselves invest in fossil fuel, they invest in developing country banks, which then invest in fossil fuel. Moreover, divestment does not really solve the problem. It leads to new investors. And worldwide, we are seeing that consumers are increasingly locked into a fossil economy. And another problem is that the Paris Agreement is essentially voluntary. So I think, to do it very quickly, I think some of the approaches are we need to continue to demand binding targets from rich countries. We need to channel investments towards renewable energy services and punish investments in fossil fuel. We need to go in for debt cancellation. We need to try and boycott companies that continue to invest in fossil fuels. We need to name and shame investors in fossil fuel. We need to give consumers an alternative. Maybe go vegan, for example. And we need to try and make Paris increasingly compulsory if we are to have any chance of meeting the 1.5 degree target. Last slide. I'd like to thank the Earth Commission and the European Research Council for enabling the research for this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyeeta. Thank you, Joyeeta, for this extremely inspiring and initial remarks. We will have so many follow-up questions for you, I'm sure. So we're going to get back to you a little bit later in the panel. We've heard your call to a really strong call to action to be extremely radical in our approaches if we want to have a safe and just transition. All of us, I think, here had in mind or having in mind the 1.5 degree framework as our sort of point of anchorage. So it's so interesting to hear from you that actually it's 1 degree, that we should have in mind. So turning now to Gilles Carbonnier, of course, I'm turning to an organization that takes action to support vulnerable communities, but also action to address the impact, environmental and climate impact of your own activities. So over to you, Gilles. Sorry, you're the Vice President of the ICRC. Sorry, I'm getting my presentation. And we're also very privileged to have you as a board member of the Climate Action Accelerator. Since 2007, you've been a professor of development economics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And prior to this, you worked with the ICRC in Iraq, Ethiopia, El Salvador, Sri Lanka, and served as an economic advisor at the ICRC's headquarters. So over to you, Gilles.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and good morning, everyone. It's great and challenging to follow suit after Joyeeta's very interesting but global overview. And I think that this article published very recently in Nature really deserves a thorough reading, and I look forward to accessing it and looking through the call for transformation that you just made, which is so important. I want now to zoom in on the realities of our humanitarian operations on the ground, and just say that our staff working mainly in Africa, across the Sahel, Lake Chad Basin, Horn of Africa region, but also in the Middle East, all the way to Afghanistan, what they witness daily is very alarming. It's this conjunction of climate change consequences compounded by very rapid environmental degradation in places where people endure protracted conflict. And if you look at the latest Global Adaptation Index of Notre Dame University, you see that indeed 2/3 of the countries that are most impacted by climate change, but also least capable and equipped to adapt to climate change, 2/3 of them are countries enduring protracted crisis, protracted conflict. And these are also countries which are called fragile, with weak institutions, where there is hardly any climate finance flowing and measures being taken to help the people impacted on the ground. So basically what we have done in this framework is to say, well, there is an urgent need to act. Maybe we have waited for too long to expect at the global level radical action which is needed, and we will now see what will happen in the COP28. But I think this call for action, and I like the title of this day, fast tracking. We need to fast track action at all levels. And it goes from the global to the national, but also to the organizational and individual level. So I will focus on the organizational level and what we do at the International Committee of the Red Cross to try to cope and contribute to this. So what we have basically done is to focus on three main axes. The first one is to limit our own ecological footprint, both climate or greenhouse gas emissions and environmental footprint. The second is to really integrate climate risk, environmental degradation in our operations, in all of our operations, and to say, even if we are meant to protect and assist people, victims of armed conflict, we need also to factor this into our operations. And this is more on the adaptation front. And the third is to try to strengthen the protection of the natural environment in legal, all the way from legal texts, international humanitarian law, down to policies and action, even in the midst of armed conflicts, through advocacy, through engagement with the governments. So I will focus mainly on the first aspect, which is mitigation at our little scale to try to reduce our own footprint. We have developed an environmental roadmap together and in partnership with the Climate Action Accelerator. And this roadmap consists of over 20 action points, which can be subsumed in three different domains. The first is to calculate a baseline of our own greenhouse gas emission by 2018, and then to have a roadmap to cut them by half until 2030. And what we discovered is that about 2/3 of these emissions are indirect. They are the result of what we purchase in terms of goods and services from supplier, and that we have absolutely to factor this into as a priority into our analysis. The second is to reduce our own wastes and to be more responsible in treating the waste that we cause where we operate. And the third is to integrate sustainability principle in our supply chains. With regards to the roadmap, I would say that the good news is that it's not a total revolution. A lot of the action point actually is to accelerate things that we have to do anyhow. Changing our vehicle fleets, moving to e-vehicles, to lighter vehicles, revisiting our travel policy to reduce some of our travels in terms of procurement, to go more local, to have shorter circuits and more, I would say, regional purchase policies. And to also engage as a responsible organization our suppliers, not only in terms of looking at their social performance, labor, and so forth, but also the environmental performance and engaging the dialogue with them. Maybe a word on the process itself to come up with this roadmap. First, it's been a participatory process. We have over 200 colleagues, both in Geneva, but also in the field, that have contributed to building the roadmap. Second, we had as a principle to say, well, this roadmap should not add a layer of bureaucracy and should not hinder our capacity to provide emergency assistance like today, for instance, in Gaza. So what would be a killer is if our heads of operations across the world would say, well, with this roadmap, we get paralyzed because we are not able to deliver. So it was key to factor this as a priority. And finally, it's very much under the humanitarian principle of do no harm, realizing that the people we seek to assist and protect are the ones most affected by climate change, by environmental degradation, and we don't want to add to the harm that is caused. Finally, what we also see is that by moving to, adopting this roadmap, we are also able to increase some of the resilience of energy systems, of water provision, and the rest in the places where we are. By going decentralized, by trying to have access to renewables, we see that even in the midst of armed conflicts, this allows maintaining essential services up and running and having less of vulnerabilities through a strike to a centralized system. Maybe just to conclude, what we know is that we shouldn't do this alone. So I think the Climate Action Accelerator, you provide a platform for the whole humanitarian sector and also the health sector to coalesce and share experience, expertise. We see that we need a lot of this expertise to be shared not only within the humanitarian sector, but also beyond with international organizations and the private sector. And we can also appreciate the fact that we engage suppliers in trying to bring bring the bar up with regard to their environmental and climate performance, joining hands with other humanitarian organizations is key to have more of a weight in our conversations with suppliers. So this is very much a work in progress, even in the very difficult financial environment that we, the International Committee of the Red Cross, like all the rest of the humanitarian sector is facing. I think it's key to maintain this as a priority and to keep walking the talk in terms of implementing these engagements and commitments, because it's, at the end of the day, will help us also to save costs when we, especially as we see energy costs are going up very fast. And it's also a question of responsibility vis-a-vis the people we seek, the most vulnerable people we are working with. So I will stop here and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Gilles. There's a lot in what you mentioned as well. And I take away one of the really important points that you mentioned on supply, working with the supply chain, supplier engagement, finding alternative products. And that's definitely a theme that's going to be important for us today. We will discuss it as we discussed food aid in our panel number 1, as well as discussing how to reshape our healthcare models in panel number 2 with the central question of accessing alternative medical products. So thank you for highlighting this theme. Last but obviously not least, Professor Sir David Nabarro, I'm turning to you. David, you're the co-director of the Institute of Global Health Innovation and Professor of Global Health at the Imperial College in London. And you're the strategic director of the Geneva-based Foundation Skills, Systems, Synergies for Sustainable Development, so 4SD. And 4SD accompanies practitioners as they advance transformation of complex, contested, people-centered systems. David has served as special envoy of the World Health Organization on COVID-19 and has led the work stream in the UN Global Crisis Response Group on food, energy, and finance since March 2022. So we've heard from the scientific community, we've worked from practical operational organizations, really looking forward to hear from you from the leadership perspective.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed. And just want to say how absolutely brilliant it is to be here. Beatrice, thank you. Joachim, thank you. Everybody in the wonderful Climate Action Accelerator, thank you. And what a stellar series of presentations we've had so far. Professor Gupta's work with Johan Rockström, the paper that was described, the Nature paper that Gilles just referred to, is super important. 7 planetary boundaries broken, not 6, 7. And I think that's really very important indeed to hold that. It's a worsening situation. And thank you, Gilles, for talking about this amazing work being done within the ICRC, such a central organization at this time. Thank you all for coming. You know, it's a busy day, and you've probably got numerous other calls on your time. But the fact that you're here means that accelerating action on climate is really central in your own thinking. And it's central in my thinking, and it's central in the thinking of so many colleagues who care about the world that will be inherited by the generation of our grandchildren and their children as well. And because you're going to hear such a lot, I thought I would just tell you now the thing that I hope you will remember as you leave here today. And that is the way in which we connect with each other and work with each other across silos, across divides, across culture, across nations. The way in which we work together is absolutely key to the future of our world and her people. So I'm going to stress to you in my few remarks now, it's not going to be technologies that save us and the kids to come. It's not going to be institutions that save us. It's going to be about us and the kind of way in which we normalize a way of working and being that is not about confrontation, conflict, competition, violence, just wars, revenge, and all that goes with that, but is about finding ways to work together. And we've all seen the power of that in the different organizations, programs, companies, and institutions in which we've worked. The ones that hum, that buzz, that excite, that make a difference are the ones where people have learnt to put the collective effort and priorities above their personal interests, ambitions, and needs. Why am I here? Just a bit of background. I did, as Beatrice said, I did have a long time working in the United Nations in different roles. If I'm an expert in one thing, it's getting different groups of people to work together when they don't really want to. And that's what I did when I was in the UN, starting here in Geneva in WHO, and then moving into different roles around the world, and eventually ending up in the office of the UN Secretary General in New York, and working on sustainable development and climate action. I worked with the Secretaries General of the United Nations as they tried to get world leaders to increase their ambition and collective impact on climate. I saw how hard it is to get justice to become the fundamental basis for action. And I can understand why Professor Gupta says it has to be compulsory. But it's not going to be compulsory. There is not the will, the political will in today's world to create compulsion. In fact, things are moving in the other way. And so the only option is to work for collective action as the norm. We had a dry run, you know. COVID-19 has been an exponential threat. It accelerated through the world, and various governments and other observers tried hard to say, well, it's not that serious. There are not that many people dying. It doesn't warrant the kind of actions being taken. And so they didn't act. And then when things got really bad, they acted in a clumsy way by imposing long lockdowns that were not justified scientifically, and ignoring the emerging evidence of what really matters is high levels of surveillance, local level community organization, and equity above all. But that was not the dominant mood among the political actors. Instead, they bickered. Is this really such a big problem? And it became party political. And we really cannot afford for climate to go down that path and stay there. So first, let's just start by at least contemplating and perhaps agreeing, if you do, that the way we live, work, interact, and govern will determine how we, within our communities and jurisdictions, will emerge from the current crises of all kinds. And that means, it means starting to do one thing, which is to find ways to work across divides of all kinds, and most importantly, to make a point of working with people with whom we disagree. Make a point of working with those we don't like. Make a point of working with those who are driven by different motives. So it does mean sitting down with the fossil fuel companies and not shutting them out. And it does mean sitting with those who despise us for our beliefs and trying to understand why they despise us, and then trying to work with them from where they're really at, to feel in to their rhythm, to their anxieties, to their concerns, and to their ambitions, and to understand them. Now, there is a technique for doing this, and it's called systems leadership. And it's got a particular edge to it. If you want to study it, it's called living systems leadership. It's about systems that are made up of living forms, but particularly made up of people. And there's a whole discipline that helps us to understand ways to work with people with whom we don't agree. And indeed, procedures that we can set up based on dialogue that enable the coming together of people with different perspectives. And all the evidence says, if you create a good atmosphere for dialogue. Even if people do not agree on everything, they will be prepared to work together and shift, because it's the relationships between them, the common identity they share, and their willingness to be part of a movement of a change that will enable them to shift, and that will be more important to them than core agreement on what needs to be done on values and on ideology. So getting there means building trust. Building trust means having an unconditional willingness to be open to others. And there's plenty of evidence to show that it works. My evidence comes from work that we're doing right now on the future of food, where in advance of a summit that Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, organized in September 2021, my team at 4SD Foundation were asked to work with the UN to create the basis for widespread dialogue about the future of food in as many countries as possible. 150 governments said, we want to do this. 1,648 dialogues took place, involving 110,000 people all over the world. And the results were posted on the internet, but more importantly, led to collective identification, including here in Switzerland, of pathways towards food systems of the future that have then held in place in 110 of these countries, not always with strength, and help people to become together as a team working for a different style of food system that is sustainable, nourishing, and that is also resilient and equitable. Now, it's not perfect. Things go wrong all the time. Somebody may try to wreck it, but you build that into your thinking and action. Another one, climate change is really affecting people's mental health everywhere. My colleagues at Imperial College in London have initiated a centre called Climate Cares, which is about helping to create the resilience in society that is necessary for effective climate action and the mindsets that are required to enable this way of working to exist. So my challenge to everybody, as you leave here, just think about it. Discuss it at home. Discuss it with your friends. Can we open up to people who we normally shut down to? Can we just focus a bit on who we follow on X Twitter, and try to follow people we don't agree with and see what they're up to? Just give it a try. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was so inspiring. I think we all want to take action now after having heard you, listen to you. Just a follow-up question to the three of you before we switch to the room. What struck me in your interventions is that on the one hand, there is so much we can do at the level of an organization. There is so much we need to do, all of us individually and as organizations as well. As you mentioned, David, we need to sit with those with whom we disagree, and we need to take that leap of faith towards action. You mentioned as well, Joyeeta, very radical approaches for action. Here in the room, we are a group assembled with representatives from civil society, NGOs, UN, governments, donors. But a lot of us, I think, mainly are from individuals from civil society, NGO world, from health and humanitarian sectors. So what can we do, actually? It's what's needed is so radical. We're trying to work on at our level of organizations. But what do you think we can do? What's the philanthropic sector can do? What's the humanitarian sector can do? What's the health sector can do faced with this gigantic challenge that we have? So passing the floor to you first, Joyeeta, and then Gilles and David.
Thank you. It's been an inspiring half an hour listening to everybody talk. And I think the question about talking to everybody I've been trying to do that for the last 34 years on climate change, including with large investors, large companies. And what you see is that there is a willingness to talk in public about what should be done on climate change. But when you get into the closed room discussions, then immediately you hear that they are reluctant to take action. And that's because in climate change it's so complicated. For example, my pension funds, my investments, they're all locked up in fossil fuel investment. And even if you try to get out of it, it's quite difficult. And you have basically at this moment about $156 trillion in fossil fuel, $156 trillion in our investment funds, part of which is invested in fossil fuel. Our fossil fuel industry is between $16 trillion and $300 trillion. So it's a really big issue which concerns all of us. And it's really quite difficult to get out of this dependence because we're all so locked in. Even the small farmer is locked in because he has to bring his food to the local markets with a diesel tractor or a diesel truck. And so you see all across the system, there's this lock-in. And to get out of this lock-in, I think there has to be some degree of sacrifice. Now, maybe you don't want to talk about it in terms of sacrifice because that is depressing. Maybe you want to talk about it in terms of an alternative happiness. And how do we achieve this alternative happiness? Is it possible? So, I mean, and that's part of the reason that is behind my storyline of we need to move towards a more compulsory world, because the talking I've seen all these years has basically led to a postponement onto the discussion at the international level as to what level is acceptable in terms of degrees in temperature. The global community basically asked for 22 degrees centigrade, small island states and less developed countries asked for 1.5, and only then did IPCC do the work on 1.5. And my fear is that in the meanwhile, we've already reached 1.2. And 1.5 is very close to being crossed. So that's the reason for the acceleration that you are all part of. And that's why I think courts have a major role to play. Courts can deal with fake news by dismissing them. Courts can make governments take action. Courts can hold companies responsible. And perhaps we need that kind of action today in order to move forward. So it's not as if I disagree with David about the need for communication, but my gut feeling is that that will not happen in time. And in the meanwhile, we'll have to deal, Gilles will have much more work to do in terms of rescuing people in climate impacted places. So I feel very strongly that rich countries have to take a clear decision and a legally binding one about what they will do in terms of climate mitigation, because only then will the poorer countries perhaps be willing not to use their fossil fuels. I'm discussing this with fossil fuel actors in developing countries quite frequently, practically every month. And they may basically come back and turn around and say to me, well, why are Western companies still investing in fossil fuel? Why are Western governments still investing in fossil fuel? And that basically means that they feel that they have the right to develop fossil fuel because that will enable them to develop. So, I mean, I don't disagree with you, David. It's just I'm trying to figure out how we can collectively solve this problem within the time frame.
David, would you like to react?
But then, Gilles, I hope you don't mind. First, yeah, okay. First of all, can I just start by saying, Joyeeta, the work you do and the results that you've managed to produce and the way you communicate is just exemplary. In no way do I want you to think that I'm being a critic in a bad way. I just think that we need to combine the strong positioning that you're doing so importantly, including your calls for sacrifice and reducing the addiction to fossil fuel economy. We need to combine that with an effort to get a much larger consensus around the importance of making shifts. And so it's both and rather than either or is what I'm asking for. Now, to get that consensus around making shifts, the only hope is to talk. You see, the way to avoid it is to deny or to park it or to just say it's too difficult. We've seen that in the past, but now we can't do that anymore. The exponential is coming up against us, whether we're farmers or whether we're living on coasts or whether we're in the Sahel. It's there and it's causing terrible conflicts and suffering. So we've got it. We've got to work on it. I would like dialogue about the world's future in the context of climate change, biodiversity loss, and the other points that Joyeeta and team have identified to be something that every school teacher encourages the children in school or the students in universities, if they're university lecturers, every employer, just creating the space at the beginning of every meeting or at the end of every week or at particularly sort of half a day a month for everybody to be just sitting and standing or however they like to be and just exchanging about what they believe needs to be done. It's only through collective consciousness that we will be able to get the other half that's necessary for what Joyeeta and Johan and others have been saying in that brilliant work. Because the scientists will say it's got to be done. There will be clamor at Dubai at COP28 saying, why on earth isn't the earth shifting? But there will be a terrible disappointment because in the negotiations, the kind of breakthroughs that everybody wants won't happen. And so we need to create a magnetic field over time, and it's got to be quick. I agree with you, Joyeeta, we can't hang around, that enables the political space to be generated so that the kind of things that Joyeeta and Johan are asking for can actually start to happen. But without that political space, without that political license, it's going to be super tricky. That's my point. And obviously, I'm not necessarily in the mainstream on this, but I'm saying it because without that, I'm really concerned that the necessary shifts will just happen too late, and there'll be an awful lot of suffering that occurs in the meantime.
Maybe to follow up on the conversation, I would like to say what we need to do is to go at scale. But when we say at scale, let me unbundle what is at scale for us at least. The first is we need to be much stronger as a sector. You mentioned, Beatrice, that here we have international organization representative, NGO representatives, and diplomats and donors. As a sector, we have tried, for instance, in December 2021, to propose a charter on environment and climate change for humanitarian organizations. We launched that charter together with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Nowadays, we have 370 plus signatories, and we have 12 states and the European Union as supporter for implementing the charter, which really goes along the different points that I mentioned. So as a sector, we coalesce and we try to have more weight. And for instance, I mentioned in the case of going through certification of suppliers who walk the talk and are responsible suppliers that help us reduce our own greenhouse gas emission. This is one way to go about it. Then when we say going at scale, I see that hardly any money goes for climate change adaptation to conflict-affected people. Because it's too risky, because it's too complex, and because it's difficult to go big in these regions. That's a shame. We are at present, for instance, in the north of Mali, going through the construction of mini dams, and these mini dams have helped restore the aquifers who had gone down 200 meters back to 60 meters. So this means that agropastoralists are again able to dig wells and have access to water. These mini dams also allow to have more irrigation through a longer time period for agriculture and pasture. So these are small-scale interventions that needs to be multiplied. And when we say going at scale, it's going at different scales. And investing in these small-scale interventions that might be, less interesting for instance, the portfolio manager of the World Bank or the Africa Development Bank, who just want to say my portfolio has doubled to this and that, so many 100 millions, but that really make a difference for the people most affected. So this is a second way. And the third one, I think, is really this conversation about opening up and having conversations with each and every one. Indeed, when we see political backlashes and the results of democratic elections, be it in Switzerland or across the world, we can see that we are in an extremely divided, polarized world. Nowadays, as a professor at the Graduate Institute, I can see that having a conversation where we invite the main stakeholders on migration, on climate change, let alone on the current situation in the Middle East, is a no-go because for some understandable reason, some of the students don't accept that certain stakeholders are invited at the table and that we engage. But these students will be the ones that will lead or contribute to make the world a better place tomorrow. And I think this call for at least knowing and understanding your opponents is key. And this is not new. As you know, communist leaders over 100 years ago say, if you want to win the battle, know the opponents, know your enemy. Exactly. So I think more than that, building bridges nowadays is absolutely of the essence. And we can see at the level of our own conversations with the actors of armed violence, the parties to armed conflict, that there are ways and means to try to influence these parties towards greater adherence to international humanitarian law. And I think in the climate sector, there are also ways and means through behavioral sciences. And Joyeeta, Gupta, you are in the School of Behavioral Sciences as well, nudging all the way from individual behavior all the way to how at the level of international relations we can nudge and force through a combination of, and I think there everyone has its role to play, a combination of political pressure asking for binding regulations and having also outcry of people who do not accept and do not want to go into the future that is looming, to other people who engage constructively in a conversation to try to move towards and bring the big ones towards a greener future. So a lot to do on our plates, but I think again it's a question of acting at all these different levels. And the Climate Action Center Accelerator, again, you have this role at the level of the sector. And I think this is these are very welcome initiatives that need to be supported.
Thank you, Gilles. Thank you all. I think we have time for questions. I'm sure there's going to have a lot of reactions and questions from the room and from the people in the chat. So if you're online, please write your questions or your remarks in the chat, and we will read them from here, from the room. And I'm turning first to the room here in Geneva. Do you have any comments, remarks? Yeah, I see a few hands raised already. So. Julien, the lady here, and I think another gentleman at the back. Can you please introduce yourself before speaking?
Should I speak first?
Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you so much for your interventions today. It was really insightful. I wanted to continue this conversation on partnership building. And I have a question on this time, 2030, that we have as a target, and it's almost tomorrow. So of course we're desperate, there's some climate anxiety, and we need rapid action. And we mentioned about radical transformation and all of this, and conversation usually take time. But my question goes into, how do you build this gap between the different interests, or the building the gap on between science, businesses, policymakers? How do you facilitate this? So yes, that's my question.
Thank you. We're going to take the three first questions first, and then turn to the panelists.
Okay. Should I go ahead? Yeah. Mary Jean Buer, I'm working as an expert for INNOSWISS, the Swiss Agency for Innovation here, and the Solar Impulse Foundation. So my question is about how, I really enjoyed the discussion. First of all, I completely agree with everything that was said. On the other hand, it's some things were, yeah, it's just hard to find the right, about the oil and gas sector in particular, whether we should engage with them or not. And I just had the idea, I used to work at the Haute École d'Ingénierie et Gestion de Canton of Vaud as a chef de projet, and we worked with many companies, including oil and gas companies, as academics. So working with them, trying to understand how do we change business models, how do we have them work together with other industries to work on things like synthetic fuels, how do we produce maybe hydrogen from solar panels? You know, they are trying to make a transition, of course, very slow. And it's true that they typically invest more in publicity, very beautiful videos of how they're going to transition and meet their 2050 targets. But in fact, when you get down to it, they always say it's expensive, and it is expensive. But I want to come to a suggestion, and I think there's an opportunity here with the humanitarian assistance community to actually use the environment to test innovative solutions for decentralized energy production, and also to make them resilient. There's a lot of solutions also for water when you combine. So I'm wondering, how can you use maybe in some communities the knowledge from the oil and gas community, those that are willing to go forward and be, futuristic, to produce energy locally from solar, from, let's just say solar, there's many other solutions. There's geothermal, we talked about other solutions, but producing hydrogen, for example, locally, using the hydrogen for the vehicles, for the humanitarian assistance, and basically making an autonomous communities all over the world. We've tried to make this happen here in Switzerland. It's very difficult. It's a huge, I can't explain it now, but it's very difficult for this to even happen here in Switzerland. But can we make it happen in developing countries where there are needs, local needs? They need to be resilient to any type of shocks, energy shocks, any energy price shocks. They need to be resilient, and we can make it happen. So that's the question and suggestion.
Thank you for your question. Next question. Can you please introduce yourself and try and be as concise as possible to give a chance to everybody to speak? Thank you.
I'll surely try to. Juan Villarejo. I work at the Enterprise for Society Center in Lausanne. It's an academic institution. And I have a remark and a question. The remark is when you have mentioned that sometimes we are constrained individually, for example, an investor that's looking for profit because of some constraint they have. I think sometimes it's about getting to a bigger scale, getting to another scale really, and thinking big. So for example, in that case, if all investors agreed and discuss together, they could agree to convince and advocate for carbon pricing, then basically you change the rules of the game. Fossil fuel investments are much higher. They don't deliver profit. So basically you're not longer constrained. So you have changed the rules of the game. And my question is related to this. Why don't I hear almost nowhere this, this solution that for me it's super powerful about pricing pollution, or it's also called the true cost of things, like true cost of food, true cost of what we have. Thank you.
And I think there was a very last question here, if you can.
So Julian from Nutriset. I've got a question to Mr. Carbonnier. You mentioned that a major proportion of the carbon footprint, but environmental footprint in general from ICRC was related to suppliers of goods and services. Of course, we are all aware about the emergency of action we should take care of. So my question is, you mentioned certification, but beside that, how concretely can we work with suppliers? Can you work with your suppliers of goods and services to push them doing better, faster? So yeah, how can we work together better between the suppliers and the emergency agencies?
Thank you. Thank you. So we have 4 questions. One, how to bridge the gap between science, business, policy making. A second remark and question on testing innovative solution for decentralized or local energy production. A third remark on scaling up investment and thinking of the true cost of items in relation to carbon pricing. And last question for Gilles on suppliers engagement. We'd like to go first. You can react to any of these questions. Joyeeta, yeah? Okay, go ahead.
I think on climate change, science has been very effective in informing policymakers. So that is not the problem. The problem is that you also have fake news, and you also have policymakers that don't want to accept the climate science. So you have you're now fighting also hugely with fake news in a society. On the issue of business, climate science has not so far really looked at the business side, the investor side of things. That is now coming up in the IPCC. So that's a separate part of the story that has to be made stronger. In terms of oil and gas, I think it's very, very useful for us to invest in sustainable renewable energy. So that means that also ensuring that the mining of the new products that we need for renewable energy is also done in a sustainable manner. That's really important. And I think scaling up that would be very important. I agree with you. I think with the true cost narrative, that's also very important. The question is, will societies accept true cost? Every time you see that a society is asked to pay a slightly higher bill for fossil fuel, people protest on the streets. And that becomes really, really difficult to even raise the cost of fossil fuel for the middle class people. So that's another question. How do we do this in a way that people don't vote out governments that are trying to do it? I think the biggest challenge I see in all 4 questions is the fact that the fossil fuel business itself has so much of its investment in the fossil fuel arena. So their assets are fossil fuel. Their assets are fossil fuel infrastructure. And so that makes it very difficult for them to do something else, because they can't sell that infrastructure. They can't sell that fossil fuel if they want to move away. And we don't want them to sell that fossil fuel to somebody else, because then there's a new vested interest in fossil fuel. I think that's the big problem that we face. And how do we deal with that is something we're trying to do research on right now.
Gilles or David, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, maybe starting with the question of Nutriset and Julien, how can we work together with our suppliers better? I think, Nutriset, you probably are among those who really revolutionized part of some activities in the humanitarian sector when it comes to fighting acute malnutrition, child malnutrition. And I think ATM machines and M-Pesa also revolutionized the way we move to cash assistance. But then we have to discuss and see together what it means overall in terms of the environmental and climate footprint of any innovation that changes the way we do business. And in that sense, I know we have engaged conversation on packaging because when you go to any place where the humanitarian community has been very active for a while, it's really very telling to see the amount of waste and the level of environmental destruction that result, and this cannot go on. So I think that it's important that in our own organizations, our purchasers and head of procurement are equipped to engage a conversation with you and to really work together to reduce our environmental footprint and to see how we can be responsible with regard to wastes and waste treatment. Much more has to be done, and that's why I think working as a sector is more, efficient and effective. Possibly also for you, and it would be interesting to hear your own views on that. And I hope you will have the opportunity to jump in. The other questions with regard to innovation and move to decentralized energy systems and being more frugal, but also more resilient. Absolutely true. We do try to integrate innovation concretely in the field. We have, for instance, installed mini grid for electricity and powering our warehouse for medical supplies in Nairobi, and from there to see whether we can replicate this. We certainly move to renewables when it comes to a lot of our systems. But what we have also done, for instance, in Gaza, over the past few years, we have invested a lot in what we call the Gaza resilience systems, which was based on a comprehensive public health impact assessment of the situation in the Gaza Strip. And through that, we have tried to precisely instill innovation that would make essential, vital services more resilient to the possibility of attacks. Then resilience has a limit. And with the level of destruction and hostilities we have now, even decentralized systems, face their limits and may not be fit for purpose at all. But still, I think this is an interesting attempt to try to test innovations and to see how we can actually leapfrog. And as you said, these kind of innovations can be then very relevant for Switzerland and other, major high-end markets as well. And the beauty of it is that some of these innovations might be also more frugal in the sense that they can be adapted and at a reasonable costs for middle-income countries. So I think this is something we should explore more, because out of necessity, we might be forced to try to move and innovate in crisis situations. And some of these innovations may be very much relevant to be replicated at a larger scale. So this, again, we need greater partnerships. I think the partnerships we are developing in terms of research and applications with ETH in Zurich and EPFL is a case in point. And we hope that this will produce tangible results also when it comes to reducing our climate footprint, but also proposing some solutions that can be scaled up outside of the sector.
I could listen to you actually for hours. Thank you for the way you do it. The questions, I think, exposed some of the constant challenges that those of us who are working on these issues face now and are going to face into the future. Let's start with the 2030 targets and how we feel about what's happening in relation to them. Just remember, those targets were set by humans through negotiation, informed by science, but it was a political negotiation that took place amidst a very exciting backdrop. It was 2015. The political negotiation took place between 2012 and 2015 after what was considered to be a very successful era with the Millennium Development Goals, but unfortunately, it was not universal. And so the Sustainable Development Goals are the first effort that there's ever been to have universal goals for the future. And the setting of the goals and the targets was an arbitrary process. So I quite accept, and I feel it myself about 60% of the time, that there is a horrible sense of things being missed. When I was in New York for the General Assembly a couple of months ago, the general line was we're halfway through the period to 2030, yet we're about 15% or 20% progressing along the journey. Terribly depressing. And what do? Do we just pack up and go home and pollute like mad and misbehave? No. No, we have to accept that those targets were developed to help us as humanity move forward with greater purpose and greater urgency. But yeah, we're not going to make them all. And so what do? We have to find better ways to make progress as much as possible through whatever avenues we can find. Most important, avoid getting paralyzed, cynical, damaged in the process. Keep yourself sane. You matter. The issues are very, very important, but you matter more than the issues. So that leads me to sort of hoping that we all will accept and continue to act as though climate change is probably the most important defining issue that humanity addresses right now. If it's not the most, it's one of the most. And we just stick with that. And we hold that in front of us, not as something to beat ourselves with, but something to bring into our daily practice. There's not one single policymaker who's going to make the decisions in any jurisdiction. It's a collective. Our systems are all about collective effort. The policymaker operates within the space and legitimacy given to her or him. It's often a long, drawn-out process, very long sometimes, unresolved. And so getting the necessary energy, the magnetic field of energy is key. And last point, find more people like Gilles Carbonnier and put them in to the top of international organizations, to the top of businesses, to the top of local authorities. And there are some. They make a huge difference. They ask the question, why not? When people are saying, you'll mess up the operations if you do this. They ask the question, who's doing it? And they get the information. And most importantly, they say, like Gilles did, we've got so much more to do. Hey, thank you.
Okay, I think there is no need to add a word after these interventions. So we'll close this keynote speech with this. You mentioned at some point, David, we need to create a magnetic field. And I think the three of you have actually started to galvanize us and create that magnetic field for us today. Thank you so much for that. Very grateful, very inspired. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.